In the quiet, peaceful village of Abodu, people lived simple lives. The village was surrounded by green fields and hills. Small houses dotted the landscape, and children played in the dirt roads while chickens clucked in the background. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else. But among these simple villagers was a man named Olum, and he was anything but ordinary. Olum was the richest man anyone had ever heard of. His fields were so vast that they seemed to touch the horizon. His cows were countless, so many that it took an entire day just to feed them all. Inside his house, gold coins were piled high in wooden chests. If wealth could be measured by what a man owned, Olum was wealthier than kings. However, Olum was not like most rich people. Instead of wearing fine clothes, he wore old, ragged ones. His shirt was torn in several places, his pants looked as if they'd been chewed by rats, and his boots were scuffed and worn down to the soles. He had the money to dress like royalty, but he chose to look like a beggar. This puzzled the villagers. Every morning, Olum would walk through the village market. With a big smile on his face, he greeted everyone he passed. "Good morning," he would call out cheerfully, but the villagers didn't smile back. Instead, they whispered to each other. "Why does he smell so bad?" a woman asked her friend, pinching her nose. "Is he mad?" another whispered, shaking her head. Even the children pointed at him and laughed. "Look, it's the ragged rich man," one boy shouted. "The smelly millionaire," another chimed in. They would giggle and run away. But Olum never got upset. He kept walking, kept smiling, and never once raised his voice at the people who mocked him. He didn't explain himself, and he didn't complain. He simply carried on as if he didn't notice their laughter or their cruel remarks. Olum's children, however, were not as patient. He had 3 of them, and they were well-dressed, polite, and clever. They went to school, played with friends, and tried to fit in with the other kids in the village. But they were deeply embarrassed by their father. At school, other children would tease them. "Your father's the smelly man," one would shout. "Doesn't he own anything nice?" another would ask. The children grew tired of hearing these taunts. They began to tell lies. "That's not our father," they said, even though they knew it wasn't true. When Olum came to their school to watch a play or attend a meeting, his children would avoid him. They pretended he wasn't there, turning their faces away when he tried to wave or speak to them. This hurt Olum deeply, though he never showed it. At home, he still greeted them warmly, asked about their day, and tried to make them laugh. But the children rarely looked at him. They kept their distance and left the room whenever he entered. Olum's wife, Norma, was also troubled by his behavior. She loved him and knew that deep down he loved his family, too. But she couldn't understand why he lived this way. "We have so much," she said to him one night. "Why don't you wear proper clothes? Why don't you clean yourself up? The whole village laughs at you, and even our children can't stand to be near you." Olum didn't answer her at first. He simply stared at the floor, his face filled with sadness. Finally, he said, "You wouldn't understand." This response frustrated Norma. She wanted to understand. She wanted to know why the man she loved would choose such a strange and lonely path. Why would he make life harder for himself and his family when they had the means to live comfortably? One evening, as Olum sat by the fire folding his ragged clothes, Norma decided she'd had enough. She made up her mind to find out the truth. She waited until Olum left early the next morning to tend his farmland. Once he was gone, she began searching the house from top to bottom. She opened drawers, looked under the bed, and checked every cupboard. Finally, hidden beneath their mattress, she found a small wooden chest. It was dusty and plain, but something about it felt important. Norma opened the chest and found a piece of paper inside. The paper was covered in strange symbols and writing she didn't understand. But as she stared at it, something strange happened. Her hands began to tremble, and a cold breeze swept through the room, even though the windows were closed. The symbols seemed to glow faintly, as if they were alive. A chill ran down Norma's spine. She wanted to put the paper back and forget she'd ever found it, but she couldn't look away. The symbols began to form words in her mind, words that weren't written in any language she knew, but that she could somehow understand. Wealth comes with a price. Speak of this, and doom will follow. Norma gasped. She realized this paper wasn't just a random note. It was a secret, a dark secret that Olum had been keeping from her and the children. It explained why he wore rags, why he never answered her questions, why he seemed so burdened despite his riches. Olum had made a deal, some kind of terrible agreement, to gain his wealth, and his ragged clothing was part of the price he had to pay. That evening, when Olum returned home, Norma confronted him. She held the paper out and said, "What is this? What have you been hiding from me?" Olum froze, his face pale. "You shouldn't have seen that," he whispered. "You don't know what you've done. I want answers." Norma demanded, "What kind of deal did you make? Why do you live this way when we could have so much more?" Olum's shoulders slumped. He sat down heavily, staring at the floor. He knew he couldn't hide the truth anymore. With a heavy heart, he began to tell Norma his story. Norma listened as Olum began to speak. His voice was low, almost a whisper, as though the walls themselves might betray his secret. "It was a long time ago," he said. "We were poor then, not just struggling, but desperate. The children were small. Do you remember? They didn't have enough food. Their clothes were full of holes. You were so thin, and I felt so useless. I couldn't bear it any longer. I stayed awake night after night, wondering how to change our lives." Norma nodded. She remembered those days vividly. She remembered the sound of her children crying with hunger, the way she patched their shirts again and again until the fabric was too thin to hold a stitch. She remembered her husband's exhausted face, his rough hands from long hours of work that never seemed to pay off. "One night, while you and the children slept," Olum continued, "I sat by the fire, just staring into the flames. I was praying, or maybe begging, for something to help us. That's when it happened." Norma leaned closer. "What happened?" she asked softly. "I heard a voice," he said, shuddering slightly. It was like a whisper, but it wasn't coming from anywhere I could see. It filled the room, like it was all around me. The voice told me that it could grant me wealth beyond my wildest dreams, but it warned that there would be a price. Norma felt a chill. "What kind of price?" she asked. Olum hesitated, his gaze fixed on the floor. At first, it didn't explain. It only said I would have everything I ever wanted. Fields full of crops, countless cattle, gold coins stacked to the ceiling. It said my family would never want for anything again. All I had to do was agree. "And you agreed?" Norma asked, her voice trembling. "I did," Olum admitted. "I thought of you and the children. I thought of the hunger, the cold winters, the way our neighbors pitted us. I was tired of struggling, so I said yes." "What happened then?" Norma pressed. The voice laughed, Olum said, his expression darkening. "It told me that the price was my pride. From that day on, I could never wear fine clothes or show my wealth openly. I had to live as if I were still a poor man. I could never explain the deal to anyone, not even you, or the wealth would vanish, and everything I had would be lost, perhaps even my life." Norma sat back, stunned. "So that's why you've been wearing these rags all these years. That's why you wouldn't explain it to me or the children." "Yes," Olum said. "I thought I could bear it. I thought that as long as you were happy, as long as the children were cared for, I could live with the shame. But I never imagined how hard it would be. The villagers' laughter, the children's rejection, your confusion. It's been more painful than I ever expected." Norma tried to process what she'd heard. She looked at the parchment in her hand, the strange symbols glowing faintly in the dim light, the words that had appeared in her mind. "Wealth comes with a price. Speak of this, and doom will follow." Played over and over again. She suddenly felt the weight of the bargain her husband had made. It wasn't just his burden. It was theirs as a family. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked. "Why didn't you let me share this burden with you?" "I was afraid," Olum said. "Afraid that if you knew, you would try to break the deal. That you'd risk everything out of anger or frustration. I didn't want to lose you. I thought I was protecting you by keeping it secret." Norma reached out and took his hand. For the first time in years, she saw the pain he had been carrying. "Olum," she said gently, "we've been living under this shadow for so long. Maybe it's time to face it together." "What do you mean?" Olum asked, fear flickering in his eyes. "I don't know," Norma admitted, "but there has to be a way to live without this secret tearing us apart. There has to be a way to lift this burden." Olum looked at her for a long moment. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that they could find a way out. But deep down, he feared the voice's warning. He feared what might happen if they tried to undo the bargain. Yet, in that moment, he felt a glimmer of hope. Hope that perhaps they could find a path forward together. As the firelight flickered in their small home, Norma held Olum's hand tightly. She resolved that she would not let their family remain broken. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she knew they couldn't continue as they had. It was time to uncover the full truth and find a way to heal. Norma couldn't stop thinking about the paper she had found, the strange symbols, and the glowing words. Her mind replayed Olum's confession over and over, each detail stirring more questions than it answered. How had this voice come to their home? Why had it chosen her husband? And most of all, what was the true cost of their wealth? Olum seemed resigned after their talk, but Norma wasn't ready to leave things as they were. She felt a deep need to understand the full extent of the bargain that had changed their lives so drastically. The next morning, as Olum left for the fields, Norma made a decision. She would search again, this time more thoroughly, and see if the paper she had found was the only clue. If there was more to learn, she needed to find it. She started in their bedroom, checking under the bed where the small wooden chest had been hidden. The chest was still there, but empty now. Olum had taken the strange parchment after their discussion the night before. She then turned her attention to the large wooden wardrobe against the wall. Opening it, she pushed aside the neatly folded spare blankets and examined the back panels. To her surprise, one of them felt loose. Pulling gently, she was able to remove it, revealing a small compartment hidden behind the wardrobe. Inside, she found another document, this one different from the first. The paper was old, its edges frayed and yellowed. Unlike the first document, which was covered in glowing symbols, this one appeared to be a letter. It was written in an old, formal style, with words she could barely understand. But what she could decipher sent a chill down her spine. The letter spoke of a pact, an agreement struck between the bearer of this parchment and the unseen guide. It described how wealth would be granted in exchange for a personal sacrifice. But it also hinted at something deeper, something more troubling. The last line stood out in particular. Should the terms be broken, let it be known that not only the wealth, but the very essence of the bearer's life shall be claimed. Their days will fade, their breath will still, and those they hold dear will not be spared the shadow. Norma's hands trembled as she read it. The warning was clear. This was no ordinary agreement. It wasn't just about wearing rags or hiding riches. The cost of breaking the deal could be devastating. She quickly returned the letter to its hiding place and replaced the loose panel, her heart racing. If Olum had known about this all along, why hadn't he told her? Had he read these words and decided to protect her by keeping silent? Or was he too afraid to face the truth himself? Norma spent the rest of the day in a daze, unsure of what to do next. When Olum came home that evening, he noticed her troubled expression. "Norma," he said softly, "what is it? Did you find something?" She hesitated, then decided to be honest. "There was another paper," she said. "A letter. It was hidden in the wardrobe." Olum's face grew pale. "You shouldn't have looked for more," he said, his voice heavy with worry. "That letter was part of the pact. The more you uncover, the more dangerous it becomes." Norma frowned. "Olum, How can I ignore this? It's not just about us. If we break the deal, it says that even the children could be affected. I can't just stand by and do nothing. I've carried this burden for years to keep you and the children safe, Olum said, his voice breaking. If you dig too deep, if you push too far, it could destroy us all. Norma felt a mix of fear and frustration. She understood his worry, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there had to be a way to break free from this deal. They had been living in fear and shame for so long. Couldn't there be a way out? A way to protect their family without continuing to hide in the shadow of this strange agreement? I can't live like this anymore, Olum, she said finally. I need to know the truth. I need to understand what we're really dealing with. If there's any chance of breaking this without losing everything, I have to try. Olum looked at her, his face filled with both love and despair. I don't want to lose you, he said. You and the children mean more to me than anything. And that's why we have to find a solution, Norma replied. We can't keep living this lie. Whatever the cost, we have to face it together. Olum nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping as he realized he could no longer keep the full truth from her. If Norma was determined to dig deeper, he had no choice but to stand by her side. Norma and Olum sat together at the kitchen table, their heads bowed over the old letter. The dim light from the oil lamp cast long shadows on the walls, and the house seemed unnaturally still. Norma's hands rested on the letter as she turned to her husband, her voice calm but firm. We need to find out more, she said. If this letter is part of the pact, there may be other clues, something that tells us how to end it. Olum shook his head, his expression weary. Norma, I've already told you, this deal can't be undone. I've tried to forget it, tried to move on. Digging into it will only bring more trouble. Norma looked him in the eye. You've carried this burden alone for too long. It's not just your secret anymore. It's ours. If there's a risk, we'll face it together. For a moment, Olum didn't respond. Then, slowly, he nodded. All right, he said, but we must be careful. There are forces tied to this pact that we can't fully understand. The next morning, they began their search. Olum reluctantly led Norma to a small, locked cabinet in the corner of the house. From it, he withdrew an envelope filled with brittle sheets of paper. I didn't want you to ever see these, he said quietly. But if you're determined, you need to know everything. Norma spread the papers out on the table. Most were written in the same ancient, cryptic style as the letter. As she studied them, patterns began to emerge. The documents described rituals, strange symbols, and warnings. But one piece stood out, a parchment that seemed different from the rest. Its words, though faded, were clearer, as if meant to be read by someone seeking answers. Breaking the pact is possible, the parchment read, but it requires a great cost. The wealth must be returned. The bearer's family must relinquish all that has been gained. Only then will the chains be lifted. Norma's heart raced. Olum, she said, this says there is a way to end it. Olum frowned, his face clouded with doubt. Returning the wealth? Do you know what that would mean? We'd lose everything. The children's futures, the land, our home. But we'd be free, Norma said. No more hiding, no more shame. And maybe, just maybe, we'd be whole again. The weight of her words sank in. Olum stared at the parchment, his mind spinning. Could they truly give it all up? And if they did, would it even work? The voice had warned him so long ago that any attempt to break the pact could lead to ruin. What if returning the wealth wasn't enough? What if they lost more than their fortune? I don't know if I can do it, Olum admitted. I made this choice for all of you. Giving it all back feels like betraying everything I've fought to provide. Norma reached for his hand. You did what you thought was best, she said. But sometimes the best decision is the hardest one. If this wealth came with a curse, then it was never truly ours to begin with. For the first time in years, Olum allowed himself to imagine life without the weight of the pact. It was a terrifying thought, but also a freeing one. He looked at Norma, seeing the determination in her eyes. She wasn't afraid of losing the gold or the land. She was afraid of losing their family, their peace, their love. "All right," he said finally. "We'll try, but we must be ready for whatever comes next." Over the next few days, they made preparations. Olum began selling off his land and cattle, distributing the wealth among the villagers. He gave away the gold coins that had once been a source of pride and fear. Norma, meanwhile, gathered their children and told them the truth. "We're going to start fresh," she said. "We may not have all the riches we once did, but we'll have each other. And that's what matters most." The children, though hesitant at first, soon saw the relief in their father's eyes. The man who had once been weighed down by secrets and guilt now seemed lighter, more at peace. Slowly, they began to understand that true wealth wasn't measured in coins or land, but in love and honesty. On the final day, Olum and Norma stood together in the village square. The last of their gold had been given away, and their home was no longer filled with treasures. Yet, for the first time in years, they felt free. As they walked back to their simple house, hand in hand, they couldn't help but notice how much brighter the sun seemed, how much sweeter the air smelled. The curse, it seemed, had lifted. They had chosen the harder path, but it was one that led them back to what truly mattered: each other,